Hello and welcome to the Ireland Inc. US-Ireland Economic Roundtable in association with Arnold Golden Gregory. I'm Sarah Freeman, Managing Editor of the Business and Finance Media Group. The theme for today is Progress Through Partnership, Deepening the Economic Relationship between the US and Ireland. Before we kick off today's fascinating discussion, I'm delighted to introduce Mike Burke, partner in Arnold Golden Gregory, to provide a brief opening as sponsors of the Ireland Inc. US-Ireland Economic Roundtable.
Good morning to those of you tuning in from the United States, and good afternoon to those of you tuning in from Ireland. My name is Mike Burke. I'm a partner with the law firm of Arnold Golden Gregory in Washington, D.C. And we're proud partners with Ireland Inc. on a series of webinars that explore the U.S.-Irish economic relationship. I'd like to welcome you to today's program, Progress Through Partnership, Deepening Economic Relationship between Ireland and the United States. As we all know, there's a long-standing and fruitful bilateral economic relationship between our countries. Each country employs more than 150,000 workers in the other, and each country has reaped untold benefits from this relationship. Today's panel is going to discuss a number of issues, including the opportunities ahead to deepen and widen economic ties between Ireland and the United States. We're going to be joined today by guest panelists, including Paschal Donohoe, the Irish Minister for Finance and President of the Eurogroup. And on that note, let me add my belated congratulations to Minister Donohoe for his election to the presidency of the Eurogroup. Danny McCoy, the CEO of IBEC. Congressman Richard Neal, a longtime friend of Ireland and chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee in the U.S. House of Representatives. And John Jordan, CEO of Ornua. Again, we're looking forward to this wonderful program. Thank you for tuning in, and please stay tuned for more great programs from Ireland Inc. on this bilateral economic relationship. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike, and we're delighted to have AGG work with us on this platform. The Ireland Inc. US-Ireland Economic Roundtable is a welcome opportunity to reflect on the symbiotic economic and cultural ties between both countries, which are underpinned by strong diplomatic links. In this regard, I'd like to welcome US Ambassador to Ireland, His Excellency Ed Crawford, who will introduce another steadfast supporter of Ireland Inc., US Secretary of Commerce Wilbur Ross.
My name is Edward Crawford. I'm the U.S. Ambassador to Ireland, and I'm speaking from Deerfield Farm, which is the residence of the U.S. Ambassador to Ireland in Phoenix Park. I'm pleased to be joining a very exciting group of individuals to discuss the economic relationship between an extensive coming and going between America and Ireland, two best friends, very important relationships for the future. And in the past, Ian Hyland has put this together as our host. He's a very accomplished entrepreneur, great range, great thinker, and he's put together an outstanding group led by Secretary Wilbur Ross. So there's a lot of very talented people in the group. They'll be discussing something that's very complicated, very important, and I just wanted to share my view of Ireland since I came here as ambassador in 2019. You know, a lot of people keep asking me about Ireland in America and in Ireland. Who are they? Where do you come from? How did the Irish become so successful in such a short period of time? You know, it's remarkable, and doesn't show any lessening of their ability to grow and expand politically, economically. There's a saying in Ireland that the Irish have a great future behind it. And I've kind of lived my life that, and I was very proud of being Irish and so forth. And my Irish story is like many other stories, but it's one of my mother, who, in 1925, as a young woman herself, went off to really an exciting trip in her life to America, singly going through Ellis Island, got into Manhattan, She was from County Cork. She met actually someone from Monaghan. They had 3 boys. And one of the 3 boys went on to be a very successful businessman if you measure building a company from scratch, because his father died when he was 16. That was the middle child, Edward. And he, together with a lot of help from a lot of people, built a business to revenues of over $2 billion with 8,000 employees worldwide. And instead of selling the business and going away, when he had an opportunity to become an ambassador, his son took over the company, so it's still a family company. It still employs thousands of people. And we're very proud of that. But back to my mom. When my mom left in 1925, in that courageous effort to build a new life for herself and ultimately for her children, it's remarkable. And this is where this idea that the Irish have a great story behind them, a great history behind them. My mother, when I first became ambassador here, the first week I drove down to Cork and went to the original homestead where my mother was one of 11 children, and someone from the media asked me, Ambassador, what are you thinking about standing there? And I said, well, I'm thinking about it. I just figured out 93 years ago, my mother left here, and she sent me back to represent her and her family and her efforts as an Irish person. Now that's a great future behind it. So I'm looking forward to this. I just wanted to share this with you. I'm looking forward to listening to all these important and the subtleties in this business relationship between Ireland and America. Very important, very strategic. With everything else that's happening around us, we need this relationship to blossom. Now I have the great pleasure to introduce Secretary Wilbur Ross. Secretary Ross is a great friend of both America and Ireland, and a very important leader for the future.
Thank you, Ian, for organizing this important forum today, and a warm welcome to Ambassador Crawford and the panelists joining today's discussion. I'm grateful for all you do to support the strong bond between our countries, a relationship whose history predates both of our nations' independence. Nearly 250,000 Irish immigrants were among the first to settle here during the colonial era. In fact, Irish immigrants played such a significant role in the American War of Independence that American General Charles Lee reported they made up half the Continental Army. Our commercial and diplomatic ties have sustained and flourished across the nearly 2.5 centuries since then, and through many challenges: 2 world wars, your country's War of Independence, the Troubles, the War on Terror, Brexit, and this year's COVID-19 pandemic. Indeed, the world looks very different from what it was November last year, when I met in person with Irish companies visiting Washington to discuss commercial investment opportunities in the United States, to discuss the potential impact of Brexit, and to discuss concerns over tariffs on Irish goods as a result of the WTO Airbus case. Still, I am encouraged that as your country's top export destination and top source of foreign direct investment, we are continuing to nurture and grow our social, cultural, and economic ties. Last year, U.S. stock of FDI in Ireland totaled more than $354 billion, and 700 companies from America support roughly 155,000 Irish jobs. Likewise, Ireland's investment position in the United States grew between 2018 and 2019 from $322 billion to $343 billion. And Irish companies support more than 294,000 U.S. jobs. From Irish food companies in Idaho, ICT companies in California, and manufacturing companies in Oklahoma, to Irish healthcare companies in Florida and New York. We welcome your country's innovation and investment in all 50 states. You are currently the fourth fastest growing compared with other nations. And I encourage Irish companies to continue your engagement as we focus on strategic industries like energy, healthcare, and ICT. We have a Select USA office at our embassy in Dublin, ready to support you and your growing operations as you look to scale up in the United States. Alongside the United States, Ireland is globally renowned for being one of the most innovative countries in the entire world. Unfortunately, as you are aware, a recent development has complicated the free flow of data that undergirds most innovative relationships between the United States and Europe. The United States remains deeply concerned about the Court of Justice of the European Union July 16 Schrems II ruling that invalidated the European Commission's adequacy decision underlying the EU-US Privacy Shield network. This ruling has negative implications for the viability of using standard contractual clauses, binding corporate rules, and other mechanisms for EU-US data transfers. Those underpin our $7.1 trillion transatlantic economic relationship. If EU and US companies continue to face legal burdens and uncertainty while transferring data across the Atlantic, the United States and Europe will face severe economic consequences. On August 10th, Commissioner Didier Reynders and I released a joint statement announcing discussions to evaluate the potential for an enhanced EU-US Privacy Shield framework to comply with the court's ruling. And on September 28th, the U.S. government released a white paper to assist organizations in assessing whether their EU-US data transfers offer appropriate protective devices in accordance with the Schrems II ruling. The Trump administration remains committed to and is actively working with our European partners to address the uncertainty created by the Schrems II ruling and find an enduring solution that entails continuity for transatlantic data flows and strong privacy protections. My department will continue to make resources available to Ireland's business and government. Deepening our bilateral economic ties is essential to economic recovery for both our nations. I thank you all again for participating in today's discussion, and I wish you a productive session.
Thank you very much to Ambassador Crawford and Secretary Ross for their ongoing support and engagement in these important conversations. With this in mind, let's get on with today's discussion. The theme for today is Progress Through Partnership, Deepening the Economic Relationship between the US and Ireland. The format for the roundtable is a Q&A on the following themes: the expansion of Irish jobs in North America, the relationships between the US, the EU and Ireland in a new world post-Brexit, and the future relationship, challenges and opportunities. If tweeting, please use the hashtag Ireland Inc. Roundtable to be part of the online conversation. Over to our panel now, where I'm delighted to be joined by Congressman Richard Neal, Chair of the House Ways and Means Committee, Minister for Finance and President of the Eurogroup Pascal Donoghue, John Jordan, Chief Executive of Ornua, and Danny McCoy, Chief Executive of IBEC. You're all very welcome and thank you for joining us. Congressman Neal, I'll come to you first if I may. You've been very engaged with Ireland Inc. and Irish American issues for the last number of years, and you're chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, so you're very aware of the challenges some Irish companies face as they expand in the US, an example being tariffs. As a policymaker in the US, what can policymakers do to render it easier for Irish companies to expand there?
Well, I think first of all, there's the long historic relationship. And there's certainly the acknowledgement that our cultural institutions, as well as our government institutions, are very similar in nature. And I have pursued a pretty assertive policy in working with the United States Trade Ambassador, Bob Lighthizer, as to the application of tariffs. I think that one of the interesting things about tariffs and the Ways and Means Committee, as you know, because tariffs are a tax issue, we have responsibility for them on the legislative side. I've always thought the threat of tariffs were more effective than sometimes the actual implementation of tariffs. We have begun, as you know, in the United States to embrace some pretty extraordinary measures that have not been used in recent American history as it relates to tariffs. Section 301, Section 203, they have been pretty much held at bay over the years, but more and more the administration has chosen to use tariffs as an opportunity to gain some traction in trade disputes. The difficulty is that there is generally a response. And I've tried hard to get Bob Lighthizer to resolve some of these issues. And some of them actually, as they relate to Ireland, he has resolved at my request. And I think that on the broader context of trade and tariffs, one of the challenges that we have in America now, despite the fact that so much of our history is based upon successful trade treaties, that trade in a lot of ways does not have the popularity that it once did. And as you know, we've just revised NAFTA, and we are pursuing, with my interest, a broader trade agreement with the European Union. But at the same time, getting our constituents to re-engage on trade has been a bit of a challenge.
Thanks for that, Congressman Neal. Some great insight there, and I will come back to you on that, but I'd like to bring Minister Donoghue in. Minister, we're talking about expansion of Irish jobs in the US, and of course the flip side is the presence of FDI in Ireland, which is crucial to exchequer returns on Irish growth. Can you elaborate on the impact of US investment in Ireland to Irish growth and how you see it evolving?
Well, it's been a absolutely essential element of the economic success that Ireland has had in recent decades. Ireland has acted as a bridge for American companies selling into Europe and selling across the world. And if you look at the nature of that investment at the moment, we would have approximately 160,000 jobs here in Ireland that are either directly created by American companies or indirectly created here in Ireland. To look at how we develop it further, we do need to rise to the agenda that Congressman Neal talked about, because the political context that he painted there of trade in America and is also reflective of the debate that's happening about trade in other parts of the world. And as policymakers and politicians, we need to rise to the challenge in that those of us who want to make the case for trade between America, between Europe, trade as a driver of an improvement in living standards for our citizens, for our constituents, we need to ensure that it delivers more against that premise. We need to ensure that trade, as it begins to develop and redevelop post-COVID-19, we engage very honestly with each other regarding what we can do to ensure that it is more mutually enriching, and that we do acknowledge the issues and concerns that are there regarding whether the further development of global trade can be to the benefit of many. And I think to ignore that concern will undermine our ability to drive global trade in the future. But if we acknowledge that concern honestly and look to see what we can do to address it, it offers a further building block for how we can drive the relationship between Ireland, America, and the European Union to an even higher and more positive level in the years and decades to come.
Thanks for that, Minister. And Danny, if I could come to you next. As Chief Executive of Ireland's largest business representative body, you've spoken about the threat posed by protectionism and US tariffs. And as your members look to expand in the US, what policy issues do you see as the main challenges? And what proactive policy decisions do you think Congressman Neil and his colleagues could take to deepen the economic relationship between the two countries? And also, what can we do on the Irish side to support increased FDI?
Well, there's a lot there, Sarah. I guess it's important to acknowledge that when it comes to trade, there is no Irish-US trade policy. It's EU trade policy. And so while we're a frontier and an important member of the European Union, it'll have to be seen in that light. And of course, Europe is well capable on the tariff front themselves to engage in it. And I think that's something we're seeing from the Boeing, Airbus, that we need to ramp that back down because, you know, in terms of world order, it's important that the US and the EU are actually together. Goods, of course, are a major contributor, but increasingly we're talking about services, we're talking about data, and we need that kind of agreement, you know, to set the new world order for this intangible economy that we've discussed about before, and the ministers certainly in the vanguard and that internationally in that conversation. So we need to start to see the future as much around services and capital movements as it is about goods, which tends to be quite a lot of focus naturally given our histories and given the tangibility of those products. And the last piece, I suppose, is that when we talk about trade, we're talking about the flow of activity, but actually it's the stock that really matters, and increasingly it's investment. And I think that we need to broaden out the investment and trade dimension. And of course, that was really what the EU-US aborted trade was about, was, you know, in terms of TTIP. It was about trade and investment. And I think we go narrowly down to trade, as the chairman said earlier on, it tends to be retaliatory at this point because we're pretty much open as a default position. But increasingly, the protectionist tendencies is to see the weaponization of tariffs. But probably the bigger prize for all of us is on the investment and possibly on the services and the future of data and the new technologies. So that's really my initial comments.
Thanks for that, Danny. And John, if I can come to you now, you represent an illustration of these policies and concepts in action as CEO of Ornua, a hugely impressive organic growth story, which accounts for the largest portion of EU butter exported to the US. You had sales of $2.3 billion last year, and recently you made a $10 million investment to expand your operation in Wisconsin. So, John, reflecting on your journey in the US, what were the specific obstacles you faced? And as you look to progressing your journey in the US, what are some of the key policy areas that would address Ornua's challenges and opportunities going forward?
Thank you, Sarah. And maybe just to put a little bit of context on Ornua, and you've touched on some of it there. So we're Ireland's largest dairy company. We export to over 100 countries around the world. Less than 0.5% of our revenues come from Ireland. As you say, about 2.3 billion in sales last year. We've 13 production facilities across the world, everywhere from China to Saudi Arabia, to Nigeria, across to Germany, Spain, UK, and of course the US. We're the owner of Ireland's first ever €1 billion food brand, in the Kerrygold brand, but we've also a very substantial ingredients business where we supply dairy ingredients to food manufacturers and food service customers. And our cheese is on over 2 million pizzas in either retail or food service per week. We're selling 10 million packets of Kerrygold per week around the world. Specifically in the US, we're the number 2 butter brand in the United States, something that I think is an incredible statement for a small island like Ireland to produce a product that can reach that level of status amongst US consumers. That's after 20 years of sustained investment in the US. We also have 3 ingredient facilities in fairly rural parts of America: Rochester in Minnesota, Hilbert in Wisconsin, and Orangeville in Western Illinois. We employ over 300 people. And in the last 6 years, we've invested over $100 million in buying companies, in expanding those companies, and making investments in those companies. Something that we're really proud of and really excited about. Part of the challenge at the moment is we'd invest more and we'd invest faster for growth, but we're hampered. And one of those that indeed Chairman Neil and indeed Danny touched on is tariffs. That dispute, which is basically an airline dispute around support for Airbus and Boeing between the United States and the EU, resulted in additional tariffs being brought in this time last year on European goods being exported into the United States. You're right, Sarah. Ornua accounts, one of the products that got hit with tariffs was butter coming from Europe, a 25% additional tariff. Ornua exports 90% of the butter coming from Europe into the US. So it's not a tariff that's penalizing Europe, it's a tariff that's penalizing Ornua and ultimately penalizing Irish farmers. That tariff is an additional $60 million a year. $60 million a year that we're paying in tax to get Kerrygold into the United States. Ultimately, we've had to put price increases through. That's hampered and damaged our growth, but it's also meant that the US consumers had to pay more. So it's a tariff that has hit Irish farmers and hit US consumers and limited our short-term ability to invest in further growth and further job creation in the US.
Thanks for that, John. Some incredible statistics there. Congressman Neil, if I can come back to you and reflecting on what John and Danny and the Minister have said, how do you see the policy landscape evolving around these issues, and what advice do you have for Irish companies tuning in on how their businesses can expand in the US? 2 very different questions, I know.
Well, the first part of it is a follow-up as to what John noted, and that is that it's really the consumer that pays the tax. Despite this argument that somehow that the tariffs have been money makers for the United States, there's no evidence that supports that. In fact, I think that the consumer pays more. Protectionism harms the growth of the economy. And I think, as I said earlier, the best way to handle this issue is diplomatically. And the root of part of the problem, obviously, is Boeing and Airbus. And it's gone on for what seems to be a career for me. And resolving that issue would make a good deal of sense. I am right now plotting how to put together TTIP again. I did question President Obama during his time. I was meeting with him in the Oval Office, and I said, Mr. President, why don't we do TTIP before we do TPP? You can sell it. I think it'll be a confidence building measure. And he said we were too far down the road, and I did remind him of presidential power. I said, Mr. President, if you decide we're going to switch right now, we're going to switch. So I think that, again, part of the argument here is that the 2 political parties in America, they're sort of reversing roles. And where Democrats had been the original party of free trade, then they became much more protectionist as the years went on, largely because we're very much dependent, for good reason, on labor. The problem for us then became that it was very difficult to put together any sort of a trade accord. And many of the workers who previously had found comfort in our positions, they began to migrate to the Republican Party, and President Trump figured out the politics and the emotions that were involved. And he took a very hard line on trade and blamed trade for all of the ills that confronted America when there was little evidence to support it, but took the position that tariffs, just emotionally driven, would solve these problems. And there's no evidence that that's the case. But I do take a particular delight in this argument that he fosters, but nobody else in his administration does, when he says the tariffs have been money makers for the United States. Even the Secretary of the Treasury will not say that.
Thanks for that, Congressman Neil. Some fascinating insight and background information there. Now, changing tack slightly, the last 12 months have highlighted the role of trade relations between the EU and Ireland, and I know all of our panellists have experience of these trade dynamics in some way. Minister, if I could come to you first. In addition to being Ireland's Minister for Finance, you're also head of the Eurogroup. how do you see Ireland's role with the US developing, and in turn, Europe's role with the US?
Well, I hope and I believe that the role and the relationship that Ireland has with the United States of America, that we will be able to continue to develop it in the years to come. It's coming off such a strong position. The foundation of it is the very strong cultural relations between the two countries, based on ties of family, of history, of travel. And I'm really confident we will be able to protect and grow that for the years to come. At the moment, probably the main concern I have about that is the great challenge, which is a practical one, of actual travel between the US and Ireland. For reasons that we all know, that travel at the moment is either restricted or very difficult to do. And I really hope that as we continue our battle with COVID-19, and hopefully as we're all successful in getting that disease to a safer place than it is today, that the practical linkages that existed between Ireland and the US of the daily transatlantic travel, that we can find a way of redeveloping that all over again. Because in many ways, that is the lifeblood of the very modern relationship that we have. In terms of US to EU and how we look to strengthen that in the years to come, so much of that will depend on the strengthening of efforts that we can make to get our trading relationship to a healthier place and to look at how we can create new agreements. I believe the most important global relationship in the world is that between the US and Europe. I believe it's based on values, I believe it's based on history, and I believe it's based on a common outlook in relation to the rest of the world. And we have to work really hard now in 2021 to look at how we can use that as a foundation for a better trading relationship, because we all know how the world is changing, and it's because the world is changing that the relationship between Europe and America is so important. And I really hope and believe there'll be opportunities to strengthen that relationship further next year, and in turn use that as a window for trying to resolve some trading difficulties that are there and have been there for a long time, but how we can look to a shared and more exciting future together. But overall, just as I said that the Ireland-US one is based on all that we have in common, when the world is changing the way it is at the moment, the relationship between Europe and the US, I think is more important than ever. And those of us who really believe in it, like I do at a political level, we have to work to look at how we can strengthen it all over again next year.
Thanks, Minister. So redeveloping those practical linkages is a real priority. Congressman Neil, if I might come to you next, you've been a leading voice on any potential free trade deal between the US and Europe, and separately the US and the UK. In recent months, you've said that there'll be no trade deal between the US and the UK if the Good Friday Agreement is compromised. Why is that so important to you, and how do you see this evolving?
Well, I think the American dimension to the Good Friday Agreement was indispensable. In addition to which, a reminder that America is a guarantor of the Good Friday Agreement. And amongst the many highlights I've had in my career, particularly as it relates to the peace process in the north of Ireland, it was walking to that border with Speaker Pelosi not long ago. We were reminded that there was an effort made to discourage us from going to the border. I called the Speaker and I said, look, I'm getting a little bit of pushback. I said, we might have to do this on our own if the State Department continues to delay. And she announced with that certain confidence that she's noted for, she said, we're going to the border. And I think for us, just to go to that border, it represented this very significant achievement in the history of American foreign policy. This was the longest standing political dispute in the history of the Western world. And since in America, domestic politics always plays out in terms of international relations, it's an understanding of the role that America played. There is beyond that idea of just this kind of historic link. It was the notion that we were honest brokers in the process. I am forever indebted to Bill Clinton for the undertaking. And he did it, by the way, at the urging of many of us at this sort of these obscure get-togethers that did not go very well at the beginning. And I think he grew so frustrated with the persistence that we had that he decided to elevate the issue, which he had promised his candidate, Clinton. But this understanding as well, that the UK, by sovereign decision, if they wish to leave European Union, that's up to them. There were referendum questions, they made that determination. But also the fundamental understanding, and that is that the success of the Good Friday Agreement should be heralded. I participated in those conversations with Prime Minister May, members of the UK government, and as recently as a visit with Dominic Raab, who came to visit with myself first and then came back again to meet with Speaker Pelosi and I, in which he got the same very firm message. If there is any threat to the Good Friday Agreement, there will be no bilateral trade agreement with the UK and the United States. But most importantly, any argument that would reestablish that border will be ill met by Congress. Last point that I'll make on this. Everybody gave up something to get to the Good Friday Agreement. Republicans gave up the argument for the immediacy of a united Ireland. The Irish Republic gave up the idea of Articles 2 and 3 of their Constitution, which laid claim to the North. In the Unionist tradition, in the UK, they gave up a hard border. So Belfast, Donegal to Derry, those are substantial achievements that I've had a chance to participate in. But I will tell you, we are going to be firm on this issue. And I think at the beginning, there was a bit of hesitancy with the UK thinking, oh, we'll just push this one past them. I think they have a very different conclusion now. And I want to say something to Paschal and the Irish government. We are very grateful to all of the political parties in the Republic for the manner in which they've been steadfast, standing together with all of us who believe this agreement to be a leadership role in the world for the United States. And I will just say this. In the meeting with Minister Raab, I said to him, do you remember what this was like 35 years ago? 30,000 British soldiers in an area the size of the state of Connecticut. It was a militarized state. Today, 2 generations have now grown up without knowing the violence of the Troubles. So our word, my Speaker, Pelosi and myself, is firm.
Thanks for that, Congressman Neal. Your persistence paid off, and it's great to hear that resolve articulated again. Danny, if I could come to you next. As CEO of IBEC, you've been a significant part of the narrative on Brexit. You've spoken about how Ireland's certainty on taxation and our membership of the EU helps differentiate us in the eyes of the US. Is that still the case?
Yeah, I think it is, Sarah. And just to echo what the chairman was saying there very eloquently about the political and historical, I think also you'll find the island of Ireland becomes very pivotal in these trade agreements because you've got 3 moving parts and the island of Ireland becomes the center part of that Venn diagram. You know, the practicality of a trade agreement is it has to have integrity. You have to be able to protect the trade agreement from third countries. And so what we have here is the new EU-US agreement, the UK-EU agreement, and also we now want to see what that UK-EU part, I probably got them mixed up there, but what we see as central to all of these is what's happening in terms of the protocol. The Ireland-Northern Ireland Protocol becomes absolutely central to the global blocks that the minister said quite rightly. The most important relationship is the US-EU. And so in that, Britain's relationship either with the US or the EU is mediated through protecting what they agreed to, not just in the withdrawal agreement, but fundamentally in the Good Friday Agreement. And I think that's absolutely central. There doesn't need to be, you know, I'm not saying there doesn't need to be any politics in it. It's actually a trade issue that all comes back to the preservation of what's in the Good Friday Agreement. And as far as the taxation model is concerned, people are sovereign to make those decisions on taxation still. And I believe that the certainty and the openness of the Irish government and the business and in fact wider society is a unique selling point for Ireland staying, honouring its commitments, long-term commitments, and being committed to being in the European Union. All of those factors, I think, means that people can bet on Ireland being a solid business platform to be a pivot between both the US and the EU, and probably increasingly between those entities and the UK as well.
Thanks, Danny. That's very interesting. John, I'd like to bring you in because with all this political discourse, there are real businesses like Ornu who are impacted by each decision in terms of how you expand and how you serve customers. Is Brexit the catalyst to forging new markets in the US? And how do you see this evolving and how will it impact Ornua? And a further question, what advice do you have for business leaders dealing with ambiguity and uncertainty arising over Brexit?
Thanks, Sarah. It's really interesting because for 4 years we've been debating the Brexit question, and I've attended many panels and discussions, listening to Danny host them and facilitate them for the business community, and indeed Minister Donoghue was on a few of those. That's been 4 years. We've had the change in tariffs going into the US in the last 12 months. And this time last year, when you're sitting down to plan 2020, you're dealing with strategies to deal with those two huge political issues. And then we're all walloped with a global pandemic of COVID-19 and layer that on top. It's just been enormous for businesses to deal with. But I think in Ireland, we're very lucky. Ireland is a unique place in the world where we have a long, rich history of, in particular, exporting, and particularly of exporting dairy products. We have an Irish government who are very open, as Danny, to use Danny's words. They're close to the business community and understand the challenges that businesses like Ornua face, both in Ireland and exporting abroad. And then there's support networks. There's people like Danny and IBEC who offer great support. There's the Irish government's food board. There's trade missions. So there is a lot of support available. We're a very tight-knit community. And I think in a lot of ways, Irish businesses are envied by their international counterparts. In terms of the UK, I think Brexit is a very sad decision. And ultimately, I think, like Chairman Neil said, this will end up hurting the consumer in the UK. The UK is a food deficit country. It will have to import. Status quo is gone. So there is a change in our trading relationship. That change in trading relationship will cost money, and that cost will likely lead to food inflation in the UK. Ultimately, that's the consumer pays for that. I think that's going to be detrimental to the UK consumer. I think it will have a negative impact on all our trade into the UK. Separate to that, we've all talked about diversification. And the other place that many Irish businesses look to is the US, for exactly the reasons that Pascal outlined, whether it's tradition, whether it's family history, whether it's travel, but it's the United States. And there's an incredible bond, as Chairman Neil said at the outset, incredible bond between Ireland and the US that gives us that draw to the US. I must say, I love the US. I love doing business there. I lived there twice, once in Chicago for 5 years and once in LA for 4 years. One of my children was actually born out there, so we went out as a family of 4 and came home as a family of 5. But it's a great place to do business. I'd encourage any Irish business to look at the US market and look at that opportunity, despite all the challenges it has today. But it's like any business. If you're strategic about where you want to invest, you need to think about what you're doing. You need to commit resources. Nobody will sell your product, your service, or your goods better than you. I think the best example of that is Kerrygold. I think we're a great example of it. In Ireland, and we're pretty unique globally, cows eat grass. There's only 2 countries in the world where cows still eat grass predominantly as their diet, Ireland and New Zealand. In the US, it's actually corn or meal. As a result, Kerrygold is yellow, it's soft, and it's creamy in taste. And if you contrast that with American butter, which tends to be white, hard, and brittle. I'm not saying one is good or bad, I'm just saying they're distinctively different. We had a belief in our product. And what we did for the first 20 years was thousands upon thousands upon thousands of tastings in stores. We'd stand there, I've done it myself, you'd stand at a demo stand, you'd butter a piece of bread and you'd give it to a consumer. Absolutely convinced that once they tasted our product, they'd convert to purchase. And we did that consistently for 20 years. That's about the resource commitment, the longevity and commitment of generations of people in Ornua who've done that. And we've been very successful at it. So if you fancy a go at the United States, it's a great place to do business. They're very clear and very direct, but you must commit the resources to doing it. And it shouldn't just be an anti-Brexit solution.
Thanks, John. Some great insight and information for businesses tuning in, and also reiterating the importance of boots on the ground, of course. As we finish with Brexit, I want to bring back our 2 elected guests for one last question on this. Congressman Neil, if I could start with you. Do you think this Brexit will have a long-term impact on how Ireland and the US do business, considering the close relationship between both Britain, Ireland and the US?
No, I don't. I think that the relationship between the United States and Ireland, as the minister described, much of it is related to European Union, but it goes beyond that. It's the cultural link, it's the history, it's the commonality of purpose, and it's also this understanding that Ireland really is the gateway to Europe. So we both have, I think, a vested interest in making sure that that relationship only continues to grow. The marvel that is the Irish economy, the resiliency of the Irish economy is in many ways very similar to the optimism of American economics. So as described here, I think building these relationships, not just culturally, but always economically as well, makes a great deal of sense.
Thanks, Congressman Neal. And Minister, reflecting on what Congressman Neal has said, Brexit continues to pose substantial challenges for Ireland. How does our relationship with the US impact that, in your opinion?
It just reminds us of the huge importance of our relationship with the US, and that the foundation of that relationship is actually non-economic. I mean, as I was hearing John talk about how he has felt living in America, it reminded me of the first time I visited America just before I started in college. And the kind of excitement of when I visited New York for the first time, but also the ease that I had been in New York, because it is something about the relationship between Ireland and America that we do have an ease with each other that is based on how well our cultures know each other and the deep comfort that is there. And that is the foundation then for a relationship country to country and economy to economy that has been so important. But as John said, it's never anything you can take for granted. It is a relationship that you have to put the right commercial work into. And John was good enough to acknowledge the resources that are there and the focus that goes on from the Government of Ireland and all of our agencies to helping businesses like John runs to be as successful as they can be in the US. And we're going to keep on doing that. But if I could maybe just conclude by building on something that Congressman Neal said earlier on in his interview with you, when he was talking about the role of American foreign policy in bringing peace to the island of Ireland. And he's emphatically correct in what he said. The American dimension to the stability of our island was and is indispensable. It played a critical role. And American political leaders like Congressman Neal were so generous and brave with their time and their leadership in order to make that happen. But I would just conclude with a wider point that is an amazing demonstration of why American foreign policy is not always like the foreign policy of other really huge countries in the world. That the foreign policy of America is aware of how it can be used as a force for peace and good in other parts of the world. And that is why 2021 and the changes we're going to have to work on are so important. The backstop to European stability, European integration, has been the tacit support that America has provided to us, to true presidents from both political parties of America. And it's how we build on that historical relationship with so much change and so much change to the political order of our world, I think is the shared challenge that next year will bring. And it's up to all of us who either economically or politically want to protect that. All of us will have a role to play now in realising that potential all over again.
Thanks for that, Minister. And that's a very fitting description, I think, of the relationship between the two countries. So as we move to the final section of today's discussion, it would be remiss not to remark on the turbulent year it's been due to the global pandemic. As we speak, US citizens are going to the polls to vote for their next president. In parallel, a last-minute Brexit trade deal hangs in the balance. So I'd like our panel to look forward with progress in mind. And Danny, I'll come to you first. Looking forward, Danny, how else can we continue to deepen the economic relationship between Ireland and the US? Danny, can you hear me there?
I think look, as you say, we're a period of great uncertainty, but there's quite a lot of noise, but the signal remains very strong. And the signal is that together we're much stronger, that we're moving into a much more modern era of where disembodiment, be it intangible or what we're doing now virtually, means that we can be closer together more of the time. And the point is, you trade with people you like, fundamentally. And that relationship between Ireland and the US is one to which we can take it onto another level and take it onto a much more global level, given what we said earlier on about the island of Ireland being in the nexus now of so many things. So I'm very optimistic for the future.
Thanks, Danny. And John, if I could come to you next. This year has been obviously an extraordinarily difficult one for businesses. What encouragement or positivity would you have for business owners listening in? And what makes you excited about the next 12 months for Ornua?
Sure. As you say, Sarah, it's just been incredible. None of us could have predicted what this would look like. And it was Thursday, 12th of March in Dublin when we started our lockdown. And we had employees physically pick up a laptop and walk out of the office. A couple of things came out of it that I'd comment on. One is our business continuity plans that were in a book on a shelf were all put into action and tested in real life, because we're still running our businesses. And we're very, very fortunate in terms of the investment we made in technology that we could do that. So that's one. It's also about the adaptability, the agility, and the commitment of people. So people, their world literally turned upside down. So people are working from bedrooms or from garages or sitting rooms, operating off kitchen tables or ironing boards, and yet they're getting the job done. So I think that's a huge call out to the commitment of people in organizations. We've also got, I think on the positive side, we'll all become much more empathetic and much more tolerant. We've been in this virtual world now for 7 months. I've seen partners come in, I've seen kids come in, I've seen the pets come in, I've seen laundry hanging on a clothes horse. You've seen everything, but we're much more accepting of that today than we probably would have been 12 months ago. You know, we'd have been very stiff upper-lipped about it. I also think our work-life balances will change. Prior to lockdown, in the 12 months prior to that, I went on 80 flights. I now look back in horror at that and say, what was I doing? Spending so much time in the air, it makes no sense. I think the new life will have a better work and life balance, less time in the airplane, and much greater use of technology. And then finally, Sarah, maybe just to close off on it, that we're looking at 3 things in Ornua, staying focused on 3 things. One is about managing the talent in the organization. How can we help and support people that they don't fall through the cracks, and that they can cope both physically and mentally with the challenges that they're faced today? Second thing is, don't forget the customer. One of the things that this pandemic has done is actually make organizations look internally. How are we responding? How are we reacting? Outside is where the customer and the consumer are. Without them, you don't have a business going forward. And the third thing is the mantra we have is to continue to make the right business decisions. The environment in your physical location has changed, but make the right business decisions for the long term, certainly for Ornua. And finally, I'd say, you know, what's going to come out of it that's good? That first trip back to Chicago or New York and sitting down for a nice steak and a bottle of wine and a few beers. In fact, Chairman Neil, my favorite beer is a Sam Adams, up from your neck of the woods. So a couple of pints of Sam Adams would go down great.
Thanks, John. That's a very positive vision indeed. Minister, you've seen firsthand the benefits of Ireland's strong economic relationship with the US. Looking across the Atlantic and also here at home, what makes you optimistic about the future? And for businesses listening in today, why should they share this optimism?
Well, I'm delighted that you take my optimism for granted, because I am very optimistic, and I'm always very optimistic by nature. But I have to say the last 12 months have brought challenges, the like of which I never thought I'd have to deal with. But in dealing with those challenges, it has deepened the optimism that I do have for what is ahead for Ireland and for our relationship with the US. And it's for 2 reasons, one of which was being summed up very nicely by John about what he said about the way people have responded in his organization. I've been reminded yet again of the inherent strengths within Ireland, within our communities and within our families. And actually the way we look after each other and the sense that we have of a duty to do that here in Ireland, I believe we have seen the benefits of that this year. And I think that is a reminder to me of the versatility and strength that we do have to deal with what is to come. So that is the kind of non-economic reason regarding why I'm very confident for the future. I've seen all that has been thrown at our country and many other countries this year, and I've seen the way Irish people have responded to it. And that gives me real hope for what we can do in the future. And then to end with an economic reason, which I feel compelled to as Minister for Finance, I do look at both how our domestic economy has responded and how our international trading dimension of the Irish economy has responded. And both of them have been incredibly resilient. If I look at how our economy is now performing as we start off the month of November, and it is far stronger than I could have hoped as recently as March or April. And that just reminds me of the inherent strength that is there within our economy. We can never take it for granted. As John said, you can never forget the customer. And the moment you take competitiveness for granted, or strength in an economy for granted, you're on your way to losing it. But I've been reminded that it's there, and I've been reminded of what we need to do to continue to look after us. So that's why on those two grounds, I have a great reason for faith regarding what we're yet to do.
Thanks, Minister. So our versatility and strength are key going forward. And Congressman Neil, you join us at a time where, regardless of the outcome, America is at another watershed moment of its history. Where do you see the most potential and challenges in broadening the relationship, be it diplomatic, cultural, and economic, between Ireland and the US?
Well, first, as a follow-up to what the minister said, it's important to remember that democracy is supposed to be noisy. And right now we're in pitch form in America. But we also respond to optimism. And I always think that it's the candidate who offers the best sense of optimism going forward that prevails. Now, there are exceptions to that, obviously, but we also know the certainty of our election cycle. And that is every 4 years on the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November, there's going to be a presidential election. And I think that the American people right now, as much as we're in a loud form of democracy and questioning maybe even some of the tenets of what we've previously agreed to, I'm confident that our institutions remain strong. And always to understand that it's in America, it's our embrace of our institutions, not our embrace of the personalities. So I think the economy of the United States, its underpinning remains very strong. I think after the election, once it's settled, I think you're going to see a broad stimulus package once again. I think there's an acknowledgement of the reality that's attached to it. But our economic institutions, unlike 2008, are in pretty good position. If we address some of the contagion that might enter into the housing market, I think that we're going to be fine. So on Wednesday morning, I hope we will awake and say, we've had another election, and as always, we've survived it.
Well, thanks for that, Congressman Neil. I hope so too. And on that note, I think we've reached a fitting end to our roundtable. I'd like to thank our panellists, Congressman Richard Neil, Chair of the House Ways and Means Committee, Minister for Finance and President of the Eurogroup, Pascal Donoghue, John Jordan, Chief Executive of Ornua, and Danny McCoy, Chief Executive of IBEC. I'd also like to thank our sponsor, Mike Burke of Arnold Golden Gregory. And to those watching, I hope you all enjoyed it, and we'll see you again soon for the next Ireland Inc. US Ireland Economic Roundtable. Thank you and goodbye.